Welcome to Bible Study with Fred. We're going to discuss just two verses in Genesis chapter 20 this morning. Genesis 20, verses 1 and 2. And Abraham journeyed from thence toward the south country and dwelled between Kadesh and Shur and sojourned in Gerar. And Abraham said of Sarah, his wife, "She is my sister." And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. As proof that Sarah was still desirable to look at an age where people lived longer and were more youthful looking and longer, and as further evidence of the customs of the time, the king of Gerar places Sarah in his harem. Abraham repeats the same, what we would call today cowardice, practice in chapter 12, as in chapter 12 in Egypt, in protecting himself from possible murder, but not his wife from humiliation. Of course, the question has been put forth in other places that perhaps this is a flashback and that the events are not always depicted in the order they happened if an earlier event helped make a point that helped explain a later event. Nevertheless, this shows us the danger of travel in those days, particularly if you had a wife other men might desire. Abimelech, king of Gerar, is used here as Pharaoh, king of Egypt, is used in 41, 46, and other verses. The question that arises as to whether or not Abimelech is a Philistine title for a king or whether it is a name. Isaac will repeat this behavior in a few chapters and dwell in the same city for a time. In 26:8, this king of Gerar is called the king of the Philistines. We see two characteristics, excuse me, of life in the ancient world. One, the molestation of visitors to a city as revealed in the story of Sodom and later in Judges 19. And two, how ancient kings might forcibly take a man's wife and kill him if they felt like it. This also shows us the political powerlessness of women used without their consent as commodities, sexual resources, or just instruments to produce progeny. The woman had no right to say no to any of this. Her value is in her usefulness to men, much like a farm animal, modified only by affection and a sense of moral custom. But when God's directive will was involved by these cultural practices, women in the Bible were blessed by being part of God's plan of producing the line that he came to earth through in his work of reconciliation of man to himself. A woman's lot in life, based on the consequences of Adam and Eve's sin and man's prevailing cultural custom, was ameliorated only by the affection her husband might have toward her and the love of and for her children, sons of which might care for her in her old age if she was widowed. Now, keep in mind again that man invents culture and civilization, and God permits him to do so by God's permissive will. God alters and modifies to lead man's efforts to an end he has ordained. Imagine that while slave ships and ships for conquest went out a couple of hundred years ago, um, missionaries went out as well. And while many missionaries were simply instruments of the conquering country or institutional church, a minority simply went out as God's instruments to save souls. We need to reorder history in our minds to see how God intervenes and directs. When you include God's actions in the course of history and cease thinking of Him as simply a first cause or standing on the sidelines waiting for a prayer, you get a different picture of history. Of course, you get a different picture of everything from biology to literature if you haven't accepted the mental condition of modernity that removes God from every equation. All right, we're going to continue with this story, this narrative here in verse 3 next time, and I hope you'll pull up your Bible and read it and think about it and pray about it.